This is the Utopia podcast. I am Chris, and alongside me is Tommy. Tommy, how's it going on this Friday night?
Pretty good tonight. A little bit disappointed in EA this week, but we'll get into that in a bit, I imagine.
That's right. This week, the big blog news was Season Showdown with a video tutorial on the mode and also a blog from producer Ben Hauenbeller. This is a mode that we've talked about before, so we're not going to get into huge detail with it. Tommy and I, we've had a podcast devoted to this a few weeks ago. There's also articles about it on NCAAstrategies.com from myself and also Pasta Padre. This is not anything new. We've known about it for a few weeks, and this is about the second week that we've heard about it in the last probably 4 weeks. So not a new feature, so we won't spend any time on it tonight. Make sure to check out our previous thoughts on the mode. During this week, we've had 4 media sites came out with their hands-on preview of NCAA Football 10. Again, nothing earth-shattering really shared in these. The only issue that really came out of it was one of the media sites came out and said that the game really didn't have any new gameplay additions. That was something that kind of caught the eye of a lot of people who've been following the blogs and also the game developers. At Operation Sports, producer Russ Canary came out and said that's not quite the case with this gameplay stuff, and he went through and he listed all of the major gameplay stuff. Before we walk through his post that talks about the gameplay additions to NCAA Football 10, let's kind of talk about the pattern that EA has had this year with NCAA Football 10 in terms of releasing their information. Tommy, you and I were talking about this before the show. What are kind of your thoughts on what they've been doing so far?
Well, it's kind of had its ups and downs throughout the year so far. Madden's been a shining example of, every week you can count on them to always have their blog post up right as soon, almost always right around noon, shortly thereafter. For some reason, the NCAA team is kind of, I guess, put it on the back burner, and we always seem to get it later in the day. In this case, we didn't hear anything about it until after 7 p.m. Central Time. By then, a lot of people, aren't really paying as much attention, and by the time the next day rolls around, other games are starting to show up on the inside blog. It's kind of annoying. It's almost like we're the redheaded stepchild of the gaming community. I understand they're in the middle of development and they're working aside from just the blog, but I guess I'm just still frustrated.
I think you bring up a very good point. I know Madden and Ian Cummings have done a great job. He is on Twitter and he talks about how he's usually writing the blogs up on the weekend or days in advance, and they're usually posting approved around midday, sometimes a little later, sometimes earlier. With NCAA, it's really been hit and miss, and lately it's been miss in terms of late evening or even pushed around to the next day or very late in the day. The Season Showdown video was initially going to be released on Wednesday. They hit a technical snafu, pushed it to Thursday with the blog. It was something that if you followed on Twitter and saw that it was coming on Wednesday, it was a disappointment. Then it got pushed to the next day. And like you said, these developers, it's kind of a double-edged sword. They have a lot to do right now. They are extremely busy getting the game approved, the bugs eliminated, getting it approved and tested in-house. Then they can go send it off to Microsoft and Sony for certification and then on for production. So I don't fault them necessarily for it being tough for them to do on a Thursday and it takes all day. But I would like to see them, or have them, start working on it earlier in the week, so that way it can be out midday Thursday. There's, I believe, 2 weeks in a row now, especially last week, the Thursday blog was buried. Come Friday, last Friday was NHL 10 community event, so the NCAA blog was instantly buried on the inside blog. And this week, we had news on Fight Night, which pushed the NCAA blog down. It was not the main story. It's unfortunate that the NCAA blog has had just a handful of hours as the main story during business hours the last 2 weeks. And that's not, I don't think it's fair to the team, and I don't think it's fair to the NCAA football community that these blogs are getting buried like they are. And I would like to see them now that the game's getting very close to being done, at least in-house, that hopefully the future blogs can come out a little earlier, and hopefully we'll finally get some more gameplay stuff. And that kind of brings us to Russ Canary's thread, where he talks about the gameplay issues. First off, Tommy, would you rather have seen more gameplay stuff early or later? It sounds like, according to Adam Thompson, a lot of the gameplay blog stuff will be coming up as we get closer to the release of the game.
Good to have a little mixture of kind of sprinkle it throughout the year, but then as a lot of people seem to have done, including myself, you kind of start to forget about some of that stuff we heard early on. I mean, stuff about the wide receiver and defensive back jostling each other, stuff like that. I mean, you almost start to forget about that because you're sitting here focused on, in this case, Season Showdown or whatever the latest mode that they've talked about was. I'd rather have it in bigger chunks than what we seem to have gotten.
And this is kind of my own personal thought or theory, and I'll let you weigh on it before we talk about Russ's post. How important is it, and do you think it hurts that we don't have a big marketing slogan as it relates to gameplay? Last year we had the wide open gameplay, something that I think the hardcore community wasn't a real big fan of. Do you think that hurts the game now? One of the media sites that had their hands-on preview, the guy came out and said there really wasn't any gameplay additions, and one of my theories is, well, without the lack of a slogan, this guy, to him, there were no changes made. When we know that anyone who's following the blog intently and closely realizes that's not the case.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, this year is, I think their slogan is "Every game matters," which ties into Season Showdown.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we don't really have one that ties into gameplay itself. Last year, wide open gameplay, of course. I don't necessarily need a slogan, but I need something to I guess kind of shine on all of these changes that we are seeing.
Yeah, I agree. I don't care for the slogan because it ends up being a punchline with once flaws or bugs or issues emerge, which I think what happened to wide open gameplay. I think the initial intent was okay, but once issues started popping up, it became a punchline. Personally, I'd rather there not be a slogan or catchphrase, but when you have game reviewers that hang their articles, hang their hat on lines like that it seems like, unfortunately, it's imperative if they want to make sure everyone realizes the changes that are made. So with that, we're going to transition into Russ Canari's thread and post talking about all of the gameplay items that have already been talked about in NCAA Football 10 over at the Inside EA Sports blog. A lot of these items we've already talked about in previous editions of the Utopia podcast, so we will probably just skim real briefly through a lot of these, but we'll go into quick details on some of them. The first one, pass blocking, the branch windows, and steering and manipulation. Tommy, can you talk about that real briefly?
Yeah, the branch windows, I don't think we'd heard very much about that before, but basically that allows defensive linemen to kind of break out of the middle of an animation. So like, for example, if you're doing a spin move and want to go chase the quarterback that just broke the pocket, you can do that now. EA's got the ability to let you kind of stop an animation. It's kind of like we had branching animations last year.
The next item Russ talks about is adaptive AI. This is something we've talked about in a previous edition of the show. We won't spend much time on it. Basically, the computer will adapt to your play calling, and the higher the difficulty level you're on, the quicker they will adapt and make adjustments. Catch steering. Catches near the sideline will try and turn the receiver up the field. Wide receiver and defensive back interactions. We've talked about this pretty extensively in a past edition of the show. This includes improvements to the route running and man coverage, jostling between the receivers and defensive backs, and working also with the press and release. Layered blending, another new item coming to NCAA Football 10, basically will allow you to throw as you're being hit, and you're going to put up a duck if this happens. I think this is going to end up making players have to decide, do I take the sack, or do I risk throwing a duck here that could either be incomplete, intercepted? You really have to weigh your options very quickly this year in terms of the passing game. Inaccurate passing, passes will now miss in a more logical direction, whereas in the past it was more random. This year, the bad passes will go in a quote-unquote proper direction, for lack of a better term. Procedural awareness, this is one of the first items we learned about with NCAA Football 10 and Madden 10. In a nutshell, this is head tracking, that basically your players will be looking towards the ball, and if they're not looking at it, they can't make a play on it. Pursuit angles is, in my opinion, the most underrated addition to the game, gameplay-wise. Anyone who played 09 realized you just needed to pretty much run a J shape or an L shape, get outside, and you could get to the corner and beat the defenders down the sideline. That's been improved. That won't be an issue in NCAA Football 10. Russ also goes into other stuff that has not been blogged about, but were talked about on some forum posts. First being computer passing improved. They will actually throw downfield more often, which I think is a huge addition. The defensive line will now get up and tip passes, and that means, as he's, in his words, tipped, not just knocked down. Pitches can be intercepted. This is the big one. And Tommy, I'm going to talk about a couple things that he says are new from Madden 09. The first being breakout of tackles, and the second being two-man tackles, something that I hope Russ will explain a little clearer down the line.
Yeah, the breakout of tackle is the basically as you're wrapped up, you can still kind of spin or juke or whatever to try to break out of that tackle. So even though the animation looks like it's about to bring you down, you won't necessarily go down. You can still either be able to fall further forward or even be able to break the tackle completely. As far as the two-man tackles, that's something I thought was always in, I assume it's the two-man quote-unquote gang tackles. That's stuff that we've actually seen in NCAA 08 for that matter, where, one guy might be holding him up, the next guy come in and level him, or just simply two guys, kind of pancake him together. Hopefully we get a little bit more information on that, but like I said, I always thought it was already in there anyways.
Russ also mentioned non-catch catches, meaning players will go for the ball or the catch, even if they will not catch the ball. Slips on routes and bad weather, players will have a chance to slip in running routes. That should make bad weather games very interesting. And there's also something we saw at the community event, a ton of new animations. Some that he mentions are a lot of new tackle animations, over-the-shoulder catches, motion handoffs, and shotgun handoffs. And he also mentions a couple big items that are coming down the pike later on that we'll have blogs about: game planning, linked plays, and defensive keys. I think 3 big additions to the game franchise that we'll learn about at a later date. With that, we're going to wrap up the show, but first, Tommy, how many days are we away from the release of NCAA Football 10?
We're getting antsier every day. We're now at 59 days remaining, so just under 2 months away. Seems like it's an eternity, but it'll be here around the corner as soon as we know it.
And we know that Team Builder the Team Builder beta will launch sometime in June, and the demo is currently at certification at Microsoft and Sony. I'm going to guess we have no word when that's coming out. I'm going to guess maybe a late June, early July release for that. For Tommy, this is Chris. Everyone, thanks for listening to this edition of the Utopia podcast.